I have the wonderful honor of introducing Dr. Coleman tonight. And I had a chance to visit with him today, and it was really wonderful to learn about his passion and expertise in the areas of estrangement and alienation. And I have his bio here. I'm sure that he probably condensed this from about a 75-page curriculum vitae. Dr. Joshua Coleman is co-chair of the Council on Contemporary Families and is a psychologist with a private practice in the San Francisco Bay Area. He has been a frequent guest on the Today Show, NPR, and the BBC, and has also been featured on Sesame Street, which he said was his favorite. And you can see it on his website with Bert and Ernie. It's so cute. 2020, Good Morning America, America Online, Coaches, CBS Life, Part 2, and numerous news programs for Fox, ABC, CNN, and NBC Television. His advice has appeared in the New York Times, the Times of London, Fortune, Newsweek, the Chicago Tribune, Slate, Psychology Today, U.S. World and News Report, Parenting Magazine, and many others. He has served on the clinical faculties of the University of California at San Francisco, the Wright Institute Graduate School of Psychology, and the San Francisco Psychology Research Group. He is the author of numerous articles and chapters and has written 4 books: The Marriage Makeover, Finding Happiness in Imperfect Harmony, The Lazy Husband, How to Get Men to Do More Parenting, and Homework. That's probably my favorite.
Housework.
Oh, housework, I'm sorry.
Homework too.
Yeah. That's part of the under the parenting part. When Parents Hurt, Compassionate Strategies When You and Your Grown Child Don't Get Along, which is a wonderful book that I've been reading and just finishing it, and really recommend it. Once you start it, you can't put it down because it's so, there's so much that I've learned from it, but it's so interesting and very well written and user-friendly. It's wonderful strategies for coping with the stresses that come with alienation and estrangement. Married with Twins, the other book, Married with Twins, Life, Love, and the Pursuit of Marital Harmony. His books have been translated into Chinese, Croatian, and Korean, and are also available in the US, UK, Canada, and Australia. So we are so excited that Dr. Coleman made the trip across country to be with us tonight. And you know he's on his way to Miami to present with his job as co-chair of the Council on Contemporary Families. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Joshua Coleman.
It's such a pleasure and an honor to be here with you all. So much of my work is either done by phone or Skype or I do my weekly webinars for estranged parents, so it's actually nice to be able to have everybody in front of me so I can see your faces and talk much more intimately and personally about this very, very personal, very, very painful, very, very deep, profound social problem. I'd like to start by thanking Amanda for founding AGA. I think it's an amazing organization. I refer people to it all the time. I think Amanda's doing incredible work. Let's just give her a word. Really remarkable, and she's an amazing host, and so is her husband. They took me out today on the bay, so I got to be on the water, and got all my jet lagged, so I'm all ready to talk, and sounds like a few of you have flown in or drove in for the talk, which I'm very flattered by. And I know Susan Hara is here. Susan was on the Today Show with me last year. do you want to wave, Susan, wherever you are? She's back there. Hope I'm not embarrassing. I'm not violating confidentiality because you're on the Today Show, right? Susan was on because she had had a reconciliation with her child, so they were telling it from kind of that perspective. But, I think the more people that can go public, I'm not advising you to go public, but the more this becomes a personal story with a face to it, the more useful it becomes. The most common statement I get, none of you will be surprised by this, whenever I do national media, the thing people always say to me when they call me is, I thought I was the only one. Before I saw your talk, before I heard you on TV or radio or whatever it was, I thought I was the only one with this problem. And it just shows. It shows how much as a society, we still have not identified this problem. There's still so much shame about it that parents worry that if they talk about it, if they try to get support from a friend or a family member, that somebody will say to them, well, you must have done something pretty bad, People don't just cut off their parents for no reason. I mean, you had to have done something pretty bad. I mean, the reality is, we probably did do something, because you're a parent, and there's no way you can be a parent without doing something bad or something your kids can complain about. But that isn't the point. The issue is, did you do something bad to deserve to have your children remove themselves from your lives? Did you do something bad enough to have your grandchildren ripped from you? Grandchildren who I know many of you have either never seen, or you actually were very instrumental in raising. I mean, to me, as a society, this is a very, very serious cultural problem. The fact that we as a society, A, haven't identified it, and B, have a blind eye to it, is appalling. So I'd like to start kind of from 10,000 feet up and talk about this as a social problem. It's because I find, working with parents, that the more these parents actually understand what's going on from a cultural perspective, because what parents always say to me is, I don't get it. I wasn't that abusive, neglectful parent. I was the parent, that before the estrangement, my kids said I was a great parent. We did things together. I was supportive. And they always say the same thing to me also. It's like, you want to see a bad parent? I had a bad parent. I wasn't, my father was abusive, or my mother, was never talked to me. I was a loving, dedicated parent. And so the kind of reasons that I'm being told to justify the estrangement make absolutely no sense. So I would like to explain some of that to you, to help you understand what's going on and why this is going on from my perspective. So I'm going to start with kind of the 10,000 feet up perspective, kind of the social, cultural part. I promise it won't be too boring. And then I'll get much more into the personal, practical part of it. So one of the myths that I'd like to dispel that I think all of you are aware of is the one that I just said, that estrangement primarily stems from serious forms of child abuse. I think those exist. I just don't think that they're the vast majority. And the second one that I'd like to dispel is that those parents who've invested the most in their children are the least at risk. My experience is that the opposite is true. That those parents who've invested the most in their children are the most at risk. So my friend and colleague, historian Stephanie Kuntz, often likes to talk about big social changes from a good news, bad news perspective. So I'd like to talk about it, borrow her frame here. So the good news of the way that parenting has changed in the past, let's say five decades, is that we've become much more interested in children's well-being. We're much more sensitive about diagnosis, problems with learning disabilities, low self-esteem, potential for drug addiction, alcohol addiction, ADD, anxiety, a whole host of things. Also, parents are just more involved. Even working mothers today spend more time with their children, for better or for worse, than parents did. Mothers did, stay-at-home moms did. In the 1960s, parents became much more concerned in the past 5 decades with what the children kind of felt. So we became much more concerned with the child's inner life, much more sensitive to that, much more empathic to that. If you look at parenting surveys in the 1920s, they show that what parents wanted from their children was to respect them, if not to fear them. They basically wanted them to kind of be conforming, upstanding members of society, people who, kind of fit in, but didn't really stand out. What parents have wanted from their children starting in the 1960s and really continuing unabated into the present is that for them to be individuals, to have their own voice, to have high self-esteem, and to really have the capacity to assert themselves. So the good news is that we're raising a crop of children who are very assertive and self-interested, And probably a high percentage, still do have a reasonably close relationship with their parents. It's not like estrangement is necessarily happening to everybody, but it's happening to a lot of families, as we all can tell here in the room. So the bad news from a social perspective is that this kind of parenting practice, where parents are really supposed to invest a lot in their children, be very concerned with them, spend a lot of time with them, creates a lot of worry in the family home. It really intensifies the family environment. And it intensifies it with a lot of guilt and worry on the part of the parents and a lot of preoccupation with the parents. So while parents, especially in the middle class prior to the 1960s, could have probably been accused of maybe being too detached or too uninvolved with their kids or too oriented to the parents' happiness, today's parents are much more likely to err on the side of over-involvement, anxiety, and an insufficient orientation to the parents' needs for respect and happiness. There's an important book written by a sociologist called Unequal Childhood, where she looked at by Net LaRoe, for those of you who are interested in this topic, and she compared working class parents to middle class parents. And one of the things that she found was that for middle class parents and above, that the kids were really comfortable bossing their parents around. And then the working class families, that did not happen. The kids did not boss around the parents. But much more importantly, in my perspective, is that she did a 10-year follow-up study of these same children when they were 19 and 20, and she found that the working class and poor young adults expressed much more appreciation for all that their parents had done for them than do the middle class children. So many parents say to me, I don't get why there's not any more gratitude here. I don't get why all the things that I did right don't count for anything. Why is it that paying for a high-quality education, or paying for therapy, or tutors, or expensive vacations, or summers abroad mean nothing to this kid now? How is it that this kid can take all of my investment in and just basically write me off as if I never existed? And now suddenly I'm a terrible parent. Now suddenly I'm like this bad person. I'm so bad, not only do they have to cut me off from them, they also have to cut me off from the grandchildren. So I think that this is a hugely important point, that whatever the benefits there have been in terms of the way that we've changed, in terms of how we've raised children, they're not right on the gratitude side of the continuum. There is a really bad imbalance there when adult children don't and can't recognize with sensitivity how much the parent did for the child and see that in terms of squaring off whatever complaint that they have about the parent. I don't know how many of you have done any of my webinars, but I have one called the 5 Most Common Mistakes of Estranged Parents. And one of the most common mistakes is that parents get oriented towards what's fair instead of just being strategic. And if it was fair, you get all kinds of credit, right? I mean, you'd be forgiven for your mistakes. You'd be forgiven for not knowing whatever you're now being accused of not knowing. You'd be forgiven for not being more sensitive to whatever you're now being accused of being not sensitive enough about. But since your child doesn't have that orientation, you're talking about it not being fair won't actually get you anywhere, unfortunately. So the other thing that happens is we've raised our children in the past 30 to 40 years in a way that you shouldn't let anybody stand in the way of your happiness. That feelings of guilt and shame are unnecessary obstacles to self-realization. And that self-realization is a really important thing, right? I mean, first of all, a lot of cultures and societies, the idea of self doesn't even exist. But the idea that you're a self that has to be fully realized and expressive and evolved and have this deep personal meaning in your life is, first of all, it's a relatively new concept, and it's particularly strong in our society, it's particularly strong today. So a recent exchange in my office illustrated this with a mother and her 24-year-old daughter, where the daughter said to the mother, "So, Mom, when you were my age, did you call Grandma every day because you wanted to, or because that's what she wanted you to do?" And the mother said, "Well, I guess because she wanted me to. I wasn't that close to her, as you know, but I felt like it was the right thing to do." The daughter said, yeah, I don't really want that kind of a relationship with you. And I said, well, what kind of a relationship would you like with your mom at this point? She said, if I want to call her, I'll call her. If I don't, then I don't want to be made to feel guilty about it. I mean, it used to be making a kid feel guilty wasn't such a terrible thing. You know, I mean, like Jewish mother guilt, I mean, it used to be kind of an affectionate thing rather than some crime, right? You know, the idea of call your mother, what, did you die? It used to be considered kind of a funny, reasonable way to show affection. No, now it's criminal to do that. Making your child feel guilty is an awful, terrible, selfish thing. And the other thing it's going to make you be accused of? What diagnosis is it going to make you be accused of? Anybody care to guess? Narcissist, exactly. How many of you have been called a narcissistic parent? Quite a few, right? I mean, if I hear that, a mother being called a narcissistic mother one more time, I'm going to shoot myself in the head. So why do they call their mothers narcissists? It's an attempt to feel more separate. That it goes to the whole thing of the ways that we've been really close to the children. Many of them don't know any way to feel separate than to devalue the parent. To say, oh, you're a narcissist, or there's something wrong with you, or there's some big problem with how you love or who you are. So it must be something pathological. So, you know, I just think this mother in this kind of benign example, they weren't estranged, they were just having conflict. And it's experienced by many parents today. It really highlights what so many parents feel, which is like, what do I get to expect from all this investment? I mean, most parents today have given their children a gold-plated childhood. I mean, how many of you in here give your children a better childhood than you had overall? Really? I'm not saying I'm surprised, but I mean, I think that's become much more the norm. And so, for most parents, it's kind of galling to be told, you know, about all the mistakes you made when you actually probably worked your butts off to give your child everything. So, often the way that we get into trouble with our kids when they first start to estrange us is that, first of all, we feel completely devalued and invalidated, but we also feel kind of pissed off. You know, it's kind of like, it's like, how dare you? You know? I mean, you have no idea how good you had it. I mean, come on. You have no idea. Man, gee, guess what? That's going to get used against you. That will not get you anywhere, right? Have any of you had that backfire on you? Yeah. It just doesn't work, right? So it goes to, it's on my 5 mistakes list. It's part of the whole guilt thing. It's part of the whole thing about trying to be strategic and not be oriented towards what's fair. So a lot of parents today are basically supposed to comport themselves like a soulmate, not a parent. You're supposed to be sensitive, but not intrusive, tolerant, but not neglectful, supportive, but not smothering. Failure to do any of those things can mean grounds for termination. And what's true with a lot of these families, a lot of this happens when kids start individual psychotherapy. Have any of you had that happen? No. A few of you have. Okay, I'm still going to talk about it. So, and one of the reasons for that is that our role as therapists prior to the 1960s was really to kind of help people fit in more with their families. It wasn't really to push back on the families. It was actually to make them get along much more as a society. So things like guilt, shame, obligation, the whole notion of codependency, right? You know, it's pathological to worry about other people and take care of their feelings. I mean, that's sort of that's a more recent idea that that's a disorder you need a support group for. I mean, not that people can't overgive, but I think the fact that there's so much made of it is kind of a problem. So a lot of what we focus on now as psychologists, therapists, is really helping the adult child not to feel so guilty, not to feel so obligated, not to feel so responsible to the parents. There's very few therapists, and it's hard to do even for me, you know, knowing as much as I do, when a kid says that, you know, their parent makes them feel too guilty or about who they are or ashamed or whatever, so they want to cut off the relationship. I mean, I can get pretty far with them, but therapists don't have as much power to really arrest that kind of a perspective as you might think that they would. In part because the society is there waving, you know, shining bright lights around it. That what's important is that you're happy. Happiness is important. Happiness is everything. I mean, to me also this obsession in American culture with happiness is kind of nauseating. I mean, I want everybody to be happy, but you can create a lot of unhappiness being happy, and you can make a lot of other people, in particular your family in your parents and your children in your pursuit of happiness. And I think that that is a very serious problem in our society and in our culture today. So I also think that the institutional markers of adulthood being pushed out later and later is hugely important here. That in the 1960s, for example, you'd be considered an adult by the time you were 24, because you could probably get a high-paying union job, even if you were a high school student. You could own a house. You could put your kids through college, even on working-class wages. So the vast majority of young adults in the 1960s, basically for the post-war period from 1950 probably into 1970, were able to really consider themselves adults through these institutional markers, right? How do I know I'm an adult? I know I'm an adult because I don't live with my parents. I know I'm an adult because I can support myself well. I know I'm an adult because I own a house. I know I'm an adult because I'm married. These days, all those institutional markers get pushed way out, really until late 20s, even 30s. And for some, it's even later. Now, what does that mean in terms of your relationship with your child? Well, what that means is that how are they going to define themselves as an adult? One of the ways that they can reassure themselves or prove themselves that they're an adult is to reject you. So that I know I'm an adult because I don't need my parents. I know I'm an adult because I can stand up to my parents and push back, and they can't do anything about it. I know I'm an adult because I can say, this is the person that I'm marrying, and these are my rules. I think those things have become much more important than they've ever been, because the children don't have other ways of being able to illustrate to themselves the reasons that they're an adult. And the other part, sort of keeping on the social aspect, is that this need may stem from the way that in the US we consider individual and family needs more as private problems requiring private solutions. So far more than any other Western industrialized nation, the parents of the United States are completely responsible for childcare, healthcare, education, and job training. And so a lack of support means that even affluent parents find themselves worrying about medical or financial emergencies when their children are younger, or shortfalls in ways that parents in many Western European and Nordic countries don't. There's a whole lot written about the laissez-faire attitude of the French parents. Oh, French parents are so relaxed. Oh, French parents, the kids don't talk back to them. Well, French parents don't have to freaking worry about retirement and health care and preschool care and child care in general, and college. The French society really has kind of figured it out a long time ago that if you want to keep families together, you actually make it easier on the parents. We haven't figured that out here. In fact, what we do makes it so much harder for parents. So what these things do is that they really heat up the parental home with a lot of anxiety and worry on the part of the parents, and preoccupation and guilt. And guess what? That kind of makes the kids feel like they have to push back at some point. All that worry and anxiety and guilt can make the child feel like they need to separate from that. They need to feel more distance from that kind of guilt that the parent has. Finally, the fact that we don't help parents more means that when the parents become old, in other societies they help parents more. It's basically on the adult child's shoulders, and we know that also can be a big problem. So, it isn't like family conflict is a uniquely American thing, but we seem to have a lot more of it than a lot of other societies do. As a woman said to me, she said, in India, we don't have all this mother hatred that you have in the United States. And it's not just India. There was a large study that was done out of USC where they compared American parents with parents in Israel, Germany, the UK, and Spain. And American families were characterized as having many more arguments and less attachment than families in other countries studied. So this all may stem from a style of individualism, meaning our orientation to the individual that's more kind of unique and unusual here. One sociologist said that it may stem from the idea that in the United States, an adolescent becomes an adult by pushing against the parent, really pushing back on whether they're going to have sex or use drugs or alcohol or date or those kinds of things. And she termed it adversarial individualism and contrasted it with Dutch parenting practices where the children are actually allowed to have a sleepover with their boyfriend or girlfriend starting at the age of 16, and they're also allowed to have alcohol with the family and that kind of thing. And I bet you there's very little estrangement there, not necessarily because they're letting their boyfriends or girlfriends sleep over, but because the society is much more supportive about it. So let's get much more into tonight's topic now that I've given you the 10,000 feet up perspective. Any brief questions about any of that before, just like a question or two before I move on? No? That's because it was just so damn clear, right? Exactly. Yeah. Go ahead.
Are most of the problems due to, are most of the problems that we're talking about due to our child or our child's spouse?
It's largely an individual, in terms of a majority, do I have a majority? I would say that probably the majority of the cases that I work with, it's because of who the child married. So I would say that is the majority. It's certainly not, doesn't describe the whole population, but a really, really, really high percentage, as we're going to talk about tonight. So one of the things I'd like to say is that there's a continuum if we're looking at daughters-in-laws and sons-in-law. And for those of you, how many of you believe that your estrangement is due to a daughter-in-law or son-in-law? Just raise your hand. Okay, everybody. And how many of you feel like it's related to the daughter-in-law? Okay, and how about son-in-laws? So it looks like it's about 2/3 daughter-in-laws, 1/3 son-in-laws. That's probably roughly similar to what I see in my practice. So from my perspective, in terms of relationships with one's daughters-in-laws or son-in-laws, what would be a good abbreviated way of saying that? So I don't have to say daughters-in-laws and sons. There's no way. Okay. So probably the majority of you are dealing with some kind of pathological relationship in terms of the side of the in-laws. Though some of you, it may have started out normally. Certainly worked with plenty of parents where things started out okay, like the parent, because we're human beings, kind of put our foot in our mouths or whatever, and then once that happens, then things just kind of start to head south. So I'd like to look at it from the perspective of your perspective as a parent, your child's perspective, and the perspective of your daughter-in-law or son-in-law. So if we start from yours, I know that some of you have had children who got married, and you may not have even found out about it until somebody told you, or maybe you saw it on Facebook, or found out that your child was going to have a child, and you were going to be a grandparent, or maybe you were involved with one or two of the other ones and they had a new one and you weren't involved. Many, probably all of you, have been very dedicated and feel very ripped off and enraged, and those are completely valid, understandable feelings. So it's starting with those cases that didn't start out that way and something that's evolved over time. From our perspective as parents, when our kids get married, or we think they're going to get married, we have a number of concerns, whether we voice them or not. And one of those is this person that my kid is marrying or going to be involved with, are they going to be respectful of me? Are they going to like me? How will his or her parents treat me or us? Will we become less of a priority than do the spouse's parents? How do we handle our negative reactions to our future daughter-in-law or son-in-law? Did my kid marry the wrong person? Since we're older, as parents, we actually have pretty good ideas about who our kid may be getting involved with, and may want to have it, say something about, gee, maybe the fact that your husband-to-be just got out of prison, is dealing meth, and, seems to have a temper issue. Maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm just crazy, maybe that's not a good idea. I mean, even something that benign for some parents can just start the ball rolling in the wrong directions. And because I hear from a lot of parents that it was just the act of just warning their kid about that it could happen, that it could start to happen. So there's plenty of potential for conflict when our children marry somebody else. And part of it is that whenever you bring two different families together, it's really like you're bringing together two different tribes or cultures. Even if they're the exact same in terms of ethnicity, class, religion, you have two different families, you're bringing together often two completely different cultures. So because of that, it increases the chance for conflict, potential engagement, disruption, hurt feelings, all of those things. So if we move on and look at it from your child's perspective, I really want to emphasize tonight, as I do probably in every single webinar that I give, the importance of the child's motivation for separateness, individuality, and autonomy as a theme in the estrangement. I don't think there's ever a case where that's not in there somewhere. In some cases, it explains 90% of their behavior. In other cases, it might explain 25% of their behavior. But it's always in there, so it's the kind of thing that we ignore at our own peril. And nowhere is there a bigger expression of one's individuality than in who our child chooses to be a partner, right? I mean, what could be more personal of a decision than to say, this is who I love, these are my values, this is what I'm attracted to, this is the kind of person that excites me, this is who I want to spend my time with. It's probably, other than a career, I mean, one of the most profound ways that an individual can express their own unique individuality. So the risks for the parent of stepping on the child's toes at that point are enormous. Now, a lot of kids, this is always interesting to me, the parent may talk about their objections or their concerns about the spouse-to-be. It may even be something relatively benign. And so many kids go and blab that to their spouse-to-be, and then you're kind of a little bit screwed, right? Because then, the future in-law, daughter-in-law, or son-in-law is like, oh, well, your mom said that about me, so I can't be close to her. Your dad said that. I mean, so that can take years to undo that kind of a thing when you tell it to your child thinking that they're going to have the judgment to not pass it on, and then they pass it on, and then you've got a whole new problem. So in terms of the adult child, there's also some anxiety for them. Will my parents like or dislike this person that I'm now in love with and thinking about marrying or married? How will I feel about their feelings? What am I going to do if they don't like them? What will this mean to me? Will this person that I'm marrying like or dislike my parents, and how will I feel about that? Are they similar to my parents in terms of religion, ethnicity, class, culture? Or are they really, really different? Is there going to be any kind of meeting of the minds or not? So early on, the seeds of conflict and estrangement may be sown when your child first falls in love with somebody else. So this is a really, really common thing. And it's particularly common for adult children who aren't really well developed in terms of their identity. I mean, in general, if you're a young adult and you really have a strong sense of who you are, and you feel very solid as a person, maybe your career is already well established, or you feel a great degree of independence. If your parents make a comment about your spouse or spouse-to-be, it's kind of like, I wish you would say that. And then the only response, right? Or please don't criticize my spouse. Or, yeah, you're right. He does have a drinking problem, but he's working on it, and I love him so. I mean, there's a whole 101 ways that an adult child could respond in a healthy way to a child's complaints, but it's often kids who aren't really as fully formed. And do you know what I mean by that? They haven't really landed yet. I mean, the research, the cognitive research shows that these days that we don't believe that the brain is fully developed until kids are close to 26. And a lot of these estrangements I see, I mean, I'm working with parents who've been estranged, their kids are 50 or something, but a high percentage of them happen somewhere in the 20 to 30 year age range. There's still quite a bit in the 30 after. But part of that has to do with their identity isn't really yet fully consolidated. They don't really have a fully strong sense of who they are. They may not feel fully launched as an adult. And so for that reason, that parents' reaction throws them more. They feel it more deeply. And to me, that's the other downside of us all being so close with our kids, is that we're actually a lot more powerful in the minds of our children than our parents might have been with us, because we've been so close and empathic and psychological. They don't have as much immunity to us. I work with a lot of single moms whose adult children or child has cut them off and gone with the dad who was very uninvolved when the child, when the mom was doing the parenting. And the mothers, they're completely confused by it. They say, well, how could that be? When I was the one who actually raised the child, why is it now that they're going to the dad who was much less involved? And the reason is that for a lot of these kids in the environment with a single mom, they don't really develop the kind of immunity to the mother's feelings that they really need. They're so close to them, they don't have the other parent to feel dependent on, so even love can start feeling overly enmeshed. And so the other parent, the less involved parent, in some ways can be kind of an engine of autonomy. They can be close to that other parent, adopt and attach with that parent, and it makes them feel more separate. So they don't have the same kind of immunity. And those are often the moms that are getting called narcissistic mothers. You know, I hear so many times from mothers who, you know, they're in conversation with their children, and the mother says, this is typically from daughters, but not always. The mother says, oh yeah, I had that happen to me, or yeah, I know what that's like, I've been struggling with that too. And the kid goes, why is it always about you? And it's kind of hard. I think a conversation is supposed to be two ways, unless I misunderstood the meaning of a conversation. So the issue of autonomy is really so important. And often we can actually drive our children further into the arms of a much less healthy spouse when we challenge or criticize that spouse or girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever, because if it triggers the autonomy issues, then it's really like the teenager who fails out of school or does drugs or whatever in a self-destructive way, because they basically want to say, well, yes, I'm shooting myself in the foot, but it's my foot. You know, I get to shoot myself in the foot. They sort of will pursue something that's actually self-destructive as a way, again, to reassure themselves that they're their own person, that they're autonomous people. So this is a very serious problem. Okay, so let's look at it now from the perspective of your daughter-in-law or son-in-law. I'm sure most of you are thinking, no thank you. Can you skip that section and go on to the other section? So, you know, there's a saying, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. Nowhere is that more true than if you've got a troubled son-in-law or daughter-in-law. The more you know about their psychology and who they are and how they think and feel, the better off you're going to be. The less you know, the more imperiled you are. You do not have to like them, you have to understand them. If you don't, you're kind of screwed, I'm sorry. And the more you can do that, the better off you're going to be. So let's start again by looking at kind of the normal, expectable conflicts that happen in families, even in a healthy son-in-law or daughter-in-law. So, you know, they may have started out with concerns about how things are going to go with their future in-laws. Are these people going to like me? Will they be too busy and intrusive? Are they going to always be over at the house? Will my partner prioritize their needs over mine? Okay, that's hugely important for those of you who were once very close to your sons. Can I just ask how many of you that's true for? You were once very close to your son, and now that they're married. So I see a lot of people, and I get that a lot from my webinars and my private practice. So it's not uncommon for the future wife or current wife to feel very, very threatened by that closeness, and to really kind of launch the beginnings of a kind of a campaign to alienate you. And now, if it's a healthier person, it may not have started out that way. If it's an unhealthy person, it may have started out very, very early. So the family history of the daughter-in-law or son-in-law is also hugely, hugely important. Because basically the way to think about it is that whatever their issues are with their own parents, in all likelihood they're going to have them with you, right? So if they felt over-controlled by their own parents, they're probably going to view you as being overly controlling. If they felt rejected or devalued or abandoned by their parents, they may view you that way, or completely react to something that you do or say and convince your child that you as parents are much more critical and rejecting than the child realizes, and that they've just been kind of a blind patsy, and now they're going to pull the wool off from their eyes. If they're estranged from their own parents, they're much more likely to push your child in that direction. That is a sad truth. You see how it works. When your kid marries somebody, they're not only marrying that particular person, they're marrying the psychology of that person. They're marrying all of that person's relationships, their whole history, their wounds and their feelings and everything. So it isn't like you're just bringing together two individuals and it's all good. You're actually, when your child marries somebody, they're marrying the whole package. So the more that we understand that thing, the more that parents are able to navigate that very, very treacherous terrain, because eventually this troubled daughter-in-law or son-in-law is going to hold a knife to your kid's throat and saying, choose. You can have me, or you can have your parents. You can't have both. Now, what a lot of you, well, probably most of you have experienced since we're talking about grandparenting, is that often it's when a baby arrives that there's an increase in anxiety on the part of the son-in-law or daughter-in-law, which often leads to stress on their part. Yeah. So my experience is that strangers often occur once there's a pregnancy or a baby. So it's often then that the limits that parents really start to increase. Well, you can come over, but you can only stay for 20 minutes. Well, you can come over, but you have to wear blue. I mean, the crazy limits that I get from hearing from parents, I mean, it's just, it really boggles my mind. The way parents are being treated like criminals by their own children, and their daughters-in-laws and sons-in-laws, where they're being, told that, well, if you're going to come, then, you can't be called grandma. You can only be called by your first name, or some other thing that none of our parents or grandparents would have ever tolerated, and working class parents would never tolerate. I mean, in general, obviously, these are sort of big generalizations that I'm making in terms of the research, but it's such a common thing, and I hear people often say to me, okay, well, I'm going to tell you my story, but I guarantee you've never heard it before. And I'm always sitting here thinking, I guarantee you I have. Because the more I do this work, the more I see how common, these struggles are. That there's really, there aren't that many permutations to it, because humans are not that different across families. So this issue of what you can and cannot do, if you're even allowed to see the baby, or pick up the baby, or hold the baby. I mean, so many parents, now the grandparents, aren't allowed to do that. So, it's not surprising to me that the majority of you, 2/3 of you, have problems with your daughter-in-law. It's because the daughter-in-laws are much more worried that the in-laws are going to interfere with her authority in the household and with the parenting of the child. A lot of women worry that they're going to get somehow diminished in the family system, that they won't be able to say, this is my house and how I get to run it. So she may be extremely reactive to any comment made by either parent, and therefore put your child into a loyalty bind as a way to reduce her own anxiety and feelings of control. So as I said earlier, this seems to be particularly true of close sons. Now that's true for a few different reasons. One is part of what makes close sons close is that they might have been nice kids, right? They might have been kind of good boys. I mean, how many of you had a good boy that's now treating you, treating you like you're this suddenly, you can't even recognize this person. That's incredibly common. And it's often just those kids that need to feel like they've got more of a backbone. They may have felt close, but they may not have felt as strong as they wanted to. Not because the parent did anything wrong, but they may now need to feel like they're much more of an empowered adult. So one of the ways that they do it, often they do it by choosing a woman who looks strong. And, it's kind of sexy to them that this woman can kind of talk back to her own parents or talk back, to his parents. In some ways, it's kind of appealing. I mean, if you're working on being stronger and more independent and less afraid of authority, then kind of going toe-to-toe with some big, powerful adult, that's a pretty good day at the beach for you, if that's what you're really working on. So a lot of them get drawn to this kind of a partner, but then they're a little bit screwed, because what they don't see in all that attraction are some of the underlying problems that might make somebody behave in that way. Because sometimes the people who look the strongest are actually the most fragile. That show of strength is actually a big defense against underlying feelings of anxiety and insecurity and fear. So I just think there's a lot to the daughter-in-law having the baby, being pregnant, etc., which really plays into these autonomy issues. So in terms of this point that I was just making about the good boys or the good girls, I mean, now that there's no longer the institutional markers of adulthood, parents are kind of the gym where kids strengthen their muscles. If they don't have it as a society to give them the reflection that they're an adult by, a good job or financial independence or other avenues of self-esteem, kind of going toe-to-toe with the parent really is a pretty powerful, strong way of showing that they're strong, independent people. So it's like parents are kind of like the gymnasium in that sense. And that's why my hardest recommendation is, which is try not to take it so personally, right? That's an easy one, isn't it? Is actually the right thing to do. It's why what can look like hate actually isn't hate. What can look like contempt actually isn't contempt. The way that these children respond is more, you have to think about it from the perspective that they're trying to master something, even when they behave in the most destructive, hurtful things. You have to look at the underlying push for health in the behavior, even when they're behaving in ways that make absolutely no sense to you. I mean, that's why I think it's important for us to talk about this as a culture and as a society, because the more we understand how much all parents are going through this, the less personally we can take it. And the less personally we take it, the more flexibility and resilience we have, the better our ability to respond in a more, what I describe as affectionately detached way, or we're not so wounded by it, or we don't respond in such an aggressive way, in the way that we really all want to, and this happens to us. I totally understand. Okay, so parenting also, in terms of the gymnasium of adulthood, is another arena where the adult child can say, this is how I know that I'm an adult. And this is the last place where you get to tell me what to do, because these are my kids, and I know how to treat them, and in fact, I'm going to be so much of a better parent than are you. Now, I really doubt that most of them are actually going to be better parents. What I see is a lot of anxiety, and a lot of extreme control for how the grandparents, if they have any contact, are supposed to act. Well, you can come in, but you can't sit in that chair. I think there's a lot of worry. And in part, it's not really the adult child's fault. We as a culture have really made parents, really of all generations at this point in time, freaked out. There's too much information. You can't turn on the TV without hearing some new study about different ways to mess up children. I mean, the whole culture is constantly breathing fear and anxiety, and the belief that you're doing something wrong, or could be doing something wrong, or should be doing it better. So it makes people very, very anxious, and parents very, very anxious of really any age. So what's interesting is that in cultures where there's arranged marriages, the families get along better, and the kids actually have happier marriages. I mean, it's kind of a funny sort of a thing. There may be other problems, particularly for the women, but the marital satisfaction overall is quite a bit higher, and the in-laws relationships are much higher, in part because they make sure that the in-laws are going to like each other. That's part of the reason that they have the marriage arranged, is because they want to make sure that the in-laws are involved. And that's part of our problem here again as a culture. We don't seem to have the concept that grandparents are really freaking important. Grandparents aren't just this kind of thing that, are sort of an add-on. I mean, there's now research that shows that grandparents are hugely important to a child's cognitive development, their social development, their feelings of safety and security in the world. I mean, this stuff isn't rocket science, right? I mean, the fact that I even, this isn't obvious to everybody, as my mother used to say, for that you need a PhD, right? I mean, it's like, it should be part of our culture, it should be part of our lexicon, that grandparents are really important, that when you cut off your parent and deprive them of their grandparents, that is a form of child abuse. That's just a wrong thing to do. And it is a kind of child abuse, because so many grandparents were really powerful, positive attachment figures to their children. And we know from the research that if a child has a strong attachment to anybody, particularly though a family member, and that's suddenly taken away from the child, that's traumatizing to the child. That can increase feelings of anxiety. It can decrease feelings of well-being. It can make the world feel like a much less safe place. So the fact that we as a culture have not made this a bigger deal is completely wrong. And that's why I think our leaders, and they're doing an amazing mitzvah, or we say in the Jewish religion, means the blessing, to make this a very public kind of a problem, because it's still very much under the radar. We as a society don't really value old people. We're still very much of a very self-centered society. So the other thing, just to return to the daughter-in-law, is that many of them operate kind of like cults in a way. It's what I call a cult of one, where it's sort of surprisingly easy to brainwash somebody in marriage. And the reason for that is that it's very hard if you're married to somebody, particularly once you have children, to go up against them, and particularly if you don't have a lot of backbone as a person. That's why, in some ways you think, oh, men, they're gonna have to let themselves be pushed around. Men are the ones who are usually getting pushed around. And that's partly because men are more conflict avoidant. They're not gonna have a big, if they can get out of a fight, they probably are going to. For a lot of men, their wives are their primary friend, if not their only friend. Most men confide in their wives before they confide in anybody else. Most parents, even today, use more emotion words with many more emotion words with girls rather than boys. So men come into marriage much less equipped to do a lot of the kind of verbal sparring and negotiating that's important. So a lot of men, they get married to these women who are very domineering or critical or hostile or have personality disorders. And they're sort of like, there's like a species that occupies an ecological niche where they just haven't evolved to deal with the predators. They just don't know what to do in response to that kind of a treatment. So they're left feeling very vulnerable and easy to manipulate. So particularly those who are married to somebody who came from a very dysfunctional family. So why is it that they would buy into it? Well, they buy into it for two different reasons. One is that it's hard to stay married to somebody and think that they're completely nuts, right? I mean, even if they're not nuts, it's hard to be married to somebody and have a child with them and think that their perspective has no merit whatsoever. It's just too confusing. If you're really attached to somebody and you're married to them, to maintain the idea that, my spouse, there must be something right about it. And usually the person who's doing the brainwashing makes it very compelling. They make it compelling either by saying, well, I think you'd feel much better if you realized how abusive your parents were, or they'll relabel behavior. Well, that's abusive. What your parents did, that's abusive. Or this is abuse, or that's over-controlling. So there's a great effort to pathologize kind of normal basic parenting or normal basic parenting mistakes. All of those things can make it easy to brainwash a kid. So part of it is that they're conflict avoidant. The other part is that they kind of have to buy into it just to make themselves stay married. Otherwise, it's too difficult. The third way that they may be kept in kind of a more brainwashed state is that the daughter-in-law or son-in-law may accuse them of being kind of weak or patsy, say, oh, you're just a little mama's boy, or you're daddy's girl, and you can't really go up against your parents. What kind of a man are you, or what kind of a person are you? So they sort of shame them or humiliate them into agreeing with them. Why do they do that? Because they want the attachment to your son or your daughter to be with them alone. They feel threatened by their attachment to you. And that's why so many of you who've had a very close relationship with your child are now being told that there's something really wrong with you as a result. So a lot of you have found that when your child cuts you off, they not only cut you off, but they cut off everybody else around you. I mean, how many of you have experienced that? Really a high percentage, right? So it's an interesting thing, right? Why couldn't the kid just cut you off, right? Well, if you're so terrible, why not just cut you off? And the real reason for that is that it means there's a certain kind of fragility in the child's perspective. If you're really grounded in your own thoughts and feelings, you can surround yourself with people who disagree with you. But if you have to cut everybody off, it means you kind of know at some level maybe that your argument has some flaws, or you're so vulnerable yourself to being persuaded in the opposite direction that you don't want anybody to counter that perspective. So that's why you don't just cut off mom or dad, you also cut off the siblings and the revered grandparents, and maybe you don't even go to the revered grandparents' funeral or something else. To me, it speaks of kind of both of a vulnerability and fragility and a rigidity, either in the child or in the daughter-in-law or the son-in-law. Often, it's because the daughter-in-law or the son-in-law feels threatened by it. They're the ones who are saying, your whole family is just screwed up. It's a sick system. You're in a sick, dysfunctional family system. I'm going to accuse you of not being unconditionally loving. It's like, and so it's either fragility on the part of your child, or it's fragility and rigidity on the part of your son-in-law or daughter-in-law, or it's both. Sometimes our kids are attracted to people who have a very similar psychology to them. So again, often these kids who look strong, whether it's your daughter-in-law or son-in-law, don't feel so strong inside. And often when it's your child that's doing it, it's an attempt to feel strong. Again, that's why I counsel so much for parents to try to be respectful when they're talking to their child and try to listen to the kernel of truth, even if you have to work really, really hard to find that kernel of truth, because that's the territory of mutual respect, right? If you say, well, I don't particularly understand why you feel that way, but I assume you have good reasons for your feelings. Now, sometimes parents are accused of things that are, really bad or wrong. I mean, I've had parents wrongly accused of molesting their children. And so what I will tell that parent is, you can say, I think it's very important. Some things that parents get accused of that are more mild or benign, I don't think parents need to get into the right or wrong of it. There's certain things though that I do think that they have to. Something like that, I do think it's important for the parent to set the record straight. Typically, that's a parental alienation syndrome kind of a situation. Although it could actually come from a therapist. I mean, I don't know if you've experienced this, Carol, with Carol's also a therapist. But sometimes therapists will say, well, the way you present is like somebody who was abused, or molested. And so then the kid comes to the parents and says, I think that you abused her and molested me. So, if the parent is told that, I counsel parents to say something like, well, I can tell you with 100% authority and confidence that never happened. I'm not psychologically capable or emotionally capable of molesting a child, certainly not my own child or any other child, and I don't think it's the kind of thing I would repress. We can talk about so-called repressed memory syndrome as well. But, and this is actually the more important part of this interaction, but I assume you're telling me this for a reason. I assume that you're raising this as a way to talk about other complaints that you might have about me that feel really bad to you. But there's other things about our relationship that have really bothered you. And this is a way of your bringing this to the surface so that we can talk about it. Now, a lot of parents don't want to do that because they worry that any kind of a validation of the child's accusations is going to make them feel more aggressive in their accusations. But really, what makes kids more aggressive in their accusations, what makes them actually escalate their accusations, is when the parents deny it and don't even find the kernel of truth. So one of the ways to think about this is really that there's separate, if we look at this from a more healthy perspective, I've been talking a lot about it tonight, sort of from the pathological, son-in-law or daughter-in-law perspective and their dynamic. But another way to think about this is sort of the separate realities frame, if you're talking about trying to have a conversation with your child where you do take responsibility and make amends. Because with the separate realities frame, you sort of are saying, as a parent, you might have missed something, right? There may have been something. I mean, with your child who says you weren't unconditionally loving. I mean, I wouldn't fight that one, right? If my kid said to me, oh, my wife says that I wasn't unconditionally loving, I just get investigated, right? Say, oh, really? Huh. What kind of examples did they give? And I would not do that to disprove. Right? Your goal there is not to disprove. It's not to prove them wrong. It's actually to find out why they think that. So you can be allied with them in some kind of way. In some ways, you want to sort of empathize with that. I mean, any of us could be accused of not being unconditionally loving all the time. I certainly was not unconditionally loving all the time. I don't know a damn parent in the world who's unconditionally loving all the time. If somebody tells you they were, they are a liar. Nobody's capable of it. Life's too damn hard. Getting along with your spouse, that's hard enough for most people. But then, raising your child, dealing with their issues. I mean, so many children don't realize that they themselves were actually part of the problem in terms of what they brought to the table, their temperament. There's a lot of genetic research now about what are called child-to-parent problems. The whole focus for the past 40 years in terms of research has been on parent-to-child effects, so how parents influence children. Now we're getting really interested in the genetic, what children bring to the table. So we know that some children temperamentally are much more likely to evoke in the parents an aggressive response. Now the kid doesn't know that, so when they later come back to the parent and say, oh, you were too aggressive, I mean, what's the parent going to say? Yeah, but you have a genetic problem that, you induced that in me. I mean, that's not going to work. So, I mean, what can you do? You can say, yeah, I do remember reacting badly to your behavior a lot. And I wouldn't even go to what the kid was doing that caused them to do that. I would just say, say, yeah, I remember that. I was pretty impatient with you quite a bit of the time. I remember that. I could see how that could have been hard for you. Now here's the other thing that's confusing to parents is that so many adult children today are saying what they want is an egalitarian relationship. They want an equal relationship. I want to feel equal to you, and that's why I want to talk about all the mistakes you made as a parent as a way to kind of be on equal footing with you. But you're probably never going to have an equal relationship with your child. They don't really want, I mean, not unless there's been an estrangement. If you have non-estranged children, then they may in fact be capable of having an equal relationship with you. If you've had an estranged relationship with your child, maybe at some point you'll get to the point where it's really equal, but I wouldn't bet on it. I wouldn't count on it. I think you have to assume that that there's something about the dynamic which is inherently problematic. And that means that you have to be more sensitive, you have to be more oriented to them. Really, it's the parents these days who should be saying, it's all about you. Because really, it's the parents now these days who have to be much more empathic to the child, and the child's needs, and the child's psychology. The parent can't really talk that much, particularly once there's been an estrangement, about how it was for them. I have a lot of parents saying to me, well, when do I get to say, once there's been a reconciliation, how awful it was for me? And I say, you may never be able to say how awful it was for you. Or if you're going to say it, you may have to say it in the most benign way if you don't want to re-trigger an estrangement. And a lot of parents will then say to me, well, I'm not sure I want it. And I'm like, dude, you're suffering, you suffered for years. Do you really want to make it be about you get to have your turn in terms of saying it? It just shouldn't be that important. I mean, I'm simplifying a very complex set of feelings, but most parents, if you actually get your kid back, assuming it's a semi-reasonable relationship, and that can take quite a long time. It isn't like once there's a reconciliation, all the clouds part, and things are completely great, you can do whatever you want. Most parents find that that's a very fragile time. But it's a very important thing to get right. So it really isn't any kind of other relationship that you have, right? So if like with a friend or your spouse or any other family member, I mean, what happens if there's a conflict? In a healthy relationship, you say your part, your friend or spouse or whoever empathizes with you, they say their part, you empathize with them. Ideally, you both learn something from that. You take it away, next time it comes up, you both have learned something. It's a much better interaction. This is not the dynamic with your adult child, particularly if you're in the midst of an estrangement. If you're in the midst of an estrangement, it's about how am I going to manage this so that my child feels more comfortable reconnecting with me. That is your only orientation. I mean, you can have the orientation that I don't care because I'm so furious and hurt, and I can support that. I've supported parents who feel like, I can't do this anymore. It's too damn hard. I get too little from my child. I feel too rejected, too misused, too abused, too hurt, too taken for granted. I can support that. I don't ever tell parents that you should stay in. I think that it's really a parent's decision at what point to give up, and I've supported parents in doing it. The only place I don't do that is with minors, and that's because minors really need the parent to stay in the game and to fight for them, even when they're making it so hurtful and so unappealing. And if it's a minor who's doing it, the probability of parental alienation syndrome is extremely high. And by minors, I mean, it can really, I wouldn't want anybody to take that have that line be too aggressive. I mean, really, I think parents shouldn't give up even if they want to until the kid's probably in their early to mid-20s, just because of the way that the brain is continuing to change and identities being consolidated. So what you're getting from the kid isn't that reliable. And a lot of parents give up at this era, and in some ways can give up prematurely. So I think there is a case to be made for giving up. I don't think that all parents have to stay in the game, but I think there are times to do it and times not to do it. So in terms of daughters-in-laws versus sons-in-laws, what I often see more with sons-in-laws is a kind of that's not like I don't see with daughters-in-laws, but with sons I see more kind of harsh, absolute, domineering and controlling behavior. They're often much less sympathetic to the female adult child's desire to stay close to the parent. With the daughter-in-law, what I often see is that because men are more conflict avoidant, the men just don't have really, the sons just don't really have kind of the will to actually fight about it. And a lot of the daughters-in-laws are close to their own mothers and their own families, and those can also kind of become more cult-like in the way these interactions go, sort of like the one that accused you of not being unconditionally loving. And that's a pretty darn powerful dynamic, an allied daughter-in-law with her mother against her mother-in-law. That's a toughie, right? Because that's quite a strong alliance. And a lot of families are like that they invite the child in, your child, your son or your daughter, and then basically the walls close up around them, and they pull your child in, they're close to your child, but then the child starts cutting off everybody. And often it's not only the parents or grandparents, it's often friends. I mean, often former friends, basically anybody who might give the child some reason to have a different idea. And so that is very much like a cult, and it is very much has in common with a lot of what brainwashing kind of research says. So, okay. One of the things that I want you to get is that your daughter or son-in-law is the gatekeeper. You cannot go around them. You have to. You can only go through them. And that means that if you're going to give a gift to your kid or your grandchildren, you have to give a gift to them. If you're going to call your child, then ideally you want to speak to your daughter-in-law or son-in-law, as nauseating as that may be. You basically want to see that they actually have the power in the dynamic, and so if you do anything that's going to threaten them in any way, then that's going to really hurt your case. They're the ones, basically like a terrorist that has your child, and they have got a bomb strapped to their chest, and the chest of your grandchildren, and the chest of your child, so that they're sort of waiting to pull the trigger on that. So you have to proceed with enormous caution and care. Failing to do that will make the whole system blow up. And so that might mean that you have to do a bunch of things you really don't want to do. You might have to write amends letters to a daughter-in-law or son-in-law that you really don't feel any need or desire to do it. You might have to give them compliments about things that you don't particularly want to do it. You basically want to just show them that you're not a threat. That's the main thing, that they have the power, you don't have the power. That's why parents are often being given these really high, kind of semi-impossible tasks to achieve. You can come over, but, whatever. I mean, all these hoops to jump through. So in some ways, it's a power dynamic. The parent has to demonstrate that they're willing to do the dance. Now, I don't think parents have to do that forever, and because it's often a very humiliating set of recommendations that parents are given by their children or by their daughters-in-laws or sons-in-laws. But I do recommend that you do it for a while, 6 months to a year. Now, part of your dialogue in that interaction isn't just with the daughter-in-law, the son-in-law, it's actually with your child. You're actually saying to your child, look, I love you so much, I'm willing to jump through these enormous, absurd hoops that your spouse is putting me through, and now you're saying you completely agree with. And that's useful to your child because not only are you speaking to them in that, you're empathizing with them. Most of these kids are kind of trapped, right? It's not really their fault that they married somebody who's holding a gun to their head. So the more kind of compassion you can have for them, as hard as that may be to feel, the more empathy you can have with the awful situation that they're in, the better it's going to go. I mean, people often don't know who they're marrying until they marry them and have children, and then sometimes, all bets are off. Often sometimes that's when the behavior really starts to come out in ways that are really scary and worrisome and problematic. So when you do that, you basically want to make it easier on your child. You want to make it so that they don't have such a big fight. If you get in a fight with your daughter-in-law or son-in-law, that increases the power of the son-in-law or daughter-in-law. It does not weaken it, right? Some people say, well, I want to show my kid how to stand up to somebody like that. I'm like, no. You're not showing them how to stand up like that. You're just going to make them feel more protected towards their spouse. You're going to trigger their autonomy issues, and it's going to make things so much worse. So that's the main thing that I want to say in conclusion in terms of dealing with your daughter-in-laws, son-in-laws. Do not think about it that you're doing it for them, but you're doing it to make it much easier on your child. And partly because you just want the child to be able to say to their spouse, look, they're doing everything you're asking for, right? You want to strengthen their hand to push back. Most of these kids do want to. They're just trapped. They're being silenced. It's like what I was saying earlier. So many parents feel like once there's been an estrangement, particularly with many years, that the kid's kind of forgotten about them. And that is not my experience, because I work with a lot of estranged adult children in my practice. And it's very rare for an estranged adult child to say to me, I just don't care, or it's good riddance, or whatever. I mean, they've got their complaints, so they wouldn't be estranged. But they often say, I miss my parent, there's a lot of good about them, I wish that things could be different, and that sort of thing. So that concludes my lecture portion of this evening.